Hi, everyone. I'm Christian, and I'm one of the editors of our book called Talking About Global Inequality. I'm so excited that today I have the great pleasure of talking to Dilip Menon, who's a Mellon Chair in Indian Studies and the director of the Center of Indian Studies in Africa, University of Witwatersrand. Is that correctly pronounced, Dilip?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, then we're good to go. And Dilip has written a really interesting contribution to us, and there's so many different things I wanted to talk to you about, Dilip. But one of the things which I think stand out in your contribution is one of the things is this concept of epistemological inequality, and you describe how there's what you say, a lack of recognition of ideas of native knowledge. You write about what you call the need for the global South to have an independent intellectual standpoint. And I think for me personally, I was a bit late coming to the recognition that this whole theme around epistemological inequality, or what others call, epistemic injustice, it's also been called by some, how that's also an aspect of global inequality. So I wanted to hear if you would be so kind to elaborate on your thoughts on this and how it connects to your thinking on global inequality.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for asking me to have this conversation. I think the important thing here is that when we think about countries that were once colonized, or we think about subaltern groups within a society, and this is regardless of whether we are speaking about the global North or South, that when one as a country or as an individual begins to reflect on one's position in society, it's very rare that you can work with categories that are drawn from your own experience. There are a set of inherited categories that you work with. And those inherited categories are part of the hierarchies of social formation, or they are part of a larger global way of addressing issues of modernity, inequality, and so on. So when I, as a scholar from the global South, begin to think about what it is to think about life, emotions, history from my space, I already have a set of categories that are there, which are part of the political economy of academic scholarship, which means that I have to address categories that are already in circulation, that if I wish to publish, for example, in journals in the US, UK, and so on, that there is already an existing discourse to which I have to fit in, right? I cannot proceed from a set of categories that arise from the landscape of categories that come from here, from my space, because these are in some sense opaque. They are not transparent. They don't translate easily. So I think this is one of the fundamental facts of this idea of epistemological inequality, that even as we try to create our own forms of thinking, these are always subordinated to the larger task of translating for an elsewhere. Right? So that's basically the idea.
Yeah, and just kind of a follow-up question to that, Dilip, because I think, it also, at least for me, it reminds me of subaltern studies, and that whole idea of saying that these specific Western concepts do not, in this case, make too much sense in terms of understanding what is really going on and what has been going on in our country, in this case being India. But what for you would be some examples of like specific categories that either simply don't work in terms of understanding that experience you're talking about, and what are some of the categories where you need to translate them for us to be able to understand what's really going on?
Actually, this is an extraordinarily big question you've asked me,
okay. Yeah.
which will probably require a semester to unravel. But let me try and answer this as simply as I can. One of the two things I'd like to say. One is this question of Euronormality, which the political scientist Sudipta Kaviraj has spoken about. So there are imagined trajectories of history so that we go from for example, from feudalism to capitalism to stages of capitalism like financial capital and so on, and that there is a paradigm which is the beloved of Marxists, that there is only one time as it were, at any given time. So the existence of heterogeneous times, of heterogeneous experiences gets left out of this, so that not all societies need to follow the same trajectory, as it were. So India, for example, becomes a democracy without being an industrialized country, right? It has elections without that sequence that is part of the Euro normality. So that's one kind of answer. The other kind of answer could really be that if we are thinking about categories that come from our parts of the world, the global south, for example, that there are ways of thinking about community and diversity and individual, which are very different from that of the West. So that, I mean, you're familiar with the now rather etiolated idea of Ubuntu, that you are constituted through your entanglements with other individuals, right? And this is something that's difficult to think about in our spaces because of that obscure object of desire, the desire to be modern in our spaces. That individuality, a kind of very radical individuality, is a feature of modernity, right? So therefore, to think about these entangled lives are not only between humans, but between humans and their ancestors, humans and spirits, humans and animals. And it's interesting that with the thinking on the Anthropocene, right, there is a way in which we're coming back to the idea of non-human intelligence and of thinking about the world not only horizontally, but vertically, right? So that we're thinking across species, we're also thinking within a cosmology. So I think there are ways in which thinking from the global south is being, in that sense, the West is catching up, as it were. Right? That huge departure marked by the enlightenment of the individual transposed against nature, transposed against the world and against community, there is now beginning to be a greater understanding, right? That we need to think about conjoined lives.
So does this mean we're getting towards less global inequality in this specific register of epistemological inequality?
I think there's greater conversation happening. There's more of a conversation happening. Inequalities are the result of structures, not of the the good intentions of individuals, as you know.
Yeah, great. Dilip, one thing else which I know has also been part of your other work, and which is not so much present in the contribution to our volume, but which is equally fascinating, is that I know you've been working a lot with oceans and what you call oceanic histories. So I was wondering whether you'd say a little bit more about that also in connection to this overarching theme of global inequality.
Yeah, again, I think this is a very big question, but I'd like to again try and think about 2 or 3 things that I'd like to say about it. The first is that most of our histories are terrestrial histories. We think with monarchs, we think about states, we think about land relations, we think about the generational structures of revenue, and of late, the idea of the nation state. So there is a kind of shell within which we conceptualize our histories, nation states, and terrestrial relations. So the question really is that if we think about human movement from 40,000 years ago, when the first anatomically modern human beings began traversing the world from Africa to Polynesia, what we have parallel to the growth of nation states, borders, passports, is the constant movement of people, right? Whether as refugees, as expatriates, as professionals, what have you. So we have to think about this, and a lot of this movement is happening across the ocean. Europe was reminded of this recently from 2015 onwards, when Lesbos and Lampedusa became figures in our imagination as Syrians walked across the water to Europe. Right? 80% of them, as we know from interviews, did not know how to swim, but they braved the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and so on to get here. So that's one thing that we need to think about, that the history of the world is constituted through migration and will be constituted through migration once global warming happens. As people, 53% of the world's population live on the coasts, right? This is something that we need to think about. So when the waters rise, people will move in. There is going to be another kind of migration happening where the ocean is something we'll have to think with. The second thing I'd like to say is that one has to think about the ocean. and the oceans, given the fact of global warming, the melting of the ice caps, the fact that the global waters will rise between 16 to 25 inches, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put it. This is going to mean that cities are going to be submerged, right? From New Orleans to Dhaka. You're thinking about the vanishing of islands like Maldives, right? 77% of Maldives is going to be underwater by 2100. So in all of this, I think the philosophical point is that we cannot any longer think with ideas of the global north, global south, first world, third world. We are all in the same shit or the same water. Let's put it that way. When the oceans rise, they shall rise as one. And we, regardless of where we are, we shall have to face the same issue of the water at our doorstep.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dilip. That's extremely fascinating. Again, I think but then, even when the water rises, it will probably hit us very differently, right? It will have very unequal impacts on different populations, as you say, whether you're...
Yes, I mean, you just have to get onto the net and think about this new feature called blue urbanism, where the rich are thinking about isolating themselves on floating islands, on ocean liners, and so on and so forth. But I think we're talking about a minority of the population which can actually escape this in some sense. I'm really concerned about the fact that even, that the minority will be affected by the fact that the world will be a changed place. Because once you have migration on this large scale, once you see the devastation of particular ecologies, as you saw happening with Katrina, for example, or the fact that Indonesia has recently relocated Jakarta, its capital, which is flooding, right? And as I said, you think about New Orleans, you think about Rotterdam, all of these are spaces that are going to be affected. And you can't say, well, 1% of the population will be quite happy, they'll float away into the sunset. But I don't think we can think about the world in that fashion.
Thank you so much, Dilip Menon, for joining us today.
Thanks, Christian. Thank you very much.